All right, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about Gary Russell Jr., the man in the Gervonta Davis fight, and says that Floyd Mayweather Jr. and their team knows that he'll beat that man. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So before we get into the subject matter of the video, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the like button, hit the share button. It goes a long way towards helping the channel grow. We're going to, in this video, we're going to talk about Gary Russell Jr. and his demand, or his request rather, to fight Gervonta Tank Davis. Gary Russell Jr. is definitely a guy that I feel a lot for, because he is one of the best fighters in the sport of boxing. But for one reason or another, he really cannot get his shine that this man deserves. He definitely deserves to be in conversations about fights with the best guys in boxing, with the Gervonta Tank Davises, but he just can't, for some reason. Some people say that it's his own unwillingness to fight more often. Or other people I think the more realistic one is that he has the skill set that a lot of people do not want to get in the ring with, because just straight up, dude, he'll beat people. And that's one of the things that Gary Russell Jr. said when he was interviewed. He was asked, who do you want to fight? And he said, man, the person that I really want to fight is I want to fight Tank. And he said, and because he knows that he is better than Tank, and that people in Tank's camp know that, hey man, stay away from guys like Gary Russell Jr., because Gary Russell Jr. is just a different type of fighter. And I agree with him. When you look, what he said was, you can look at certain fighters and you say, oh man, that guy is good. But then you look at Gary Russell, you be like, man, that guy is really, really good. That's a feeling I get off pretty much all of those Russell brothers when I see him fight. Gary Antoine Russell, Gary Antonio Russell, and Gary Russell Jr. All three of them, when I watch them in rings, I'm like, man, I don't know what they putting in these guys' food, but these are some of the best fighters in the world. And I don't understand exactly what it is that gets these guys to where they can't have these big marquee fights. I hear Antoine Russell's at 140 pounds. And, I know he's early on in his career, but I don't hear the calls about him fighting Josh Taylor, or him maybe moving up. I have heard a little bit about him moving up to fight guys like Jaron Ennis and guys like that, or even the Devin Haney's. You just don't hear those Russell's names, because I think it's pretty much wrapped up into the politics. Why you don't hear these guys' names mentioned with these other young stars, or fighting some of these. Now it seems like Gary Antonio Russell is starting to get, he's starting to move and shake, but Gary Russell Jr. is still being avoided. Now, as far as the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, that fight is a fight that, for me, between he and Gervonta Davis, is a pick'em fight, and is definitely as good a fight as any of the other fights that could take place that would take place for Gervonta Davis at lightweight or 130 pounds. Gary Russell Jr. is somebody that has beaten Oscar Valdez, and he's beaten Jojo Diaz, and Jojo Diaz is in the running for a Gervonta Davis fight. So I'm not sure why Gary Russell Jr. wouldn't be. But will the fight in the fight? How I see the fight happening is, I would see that Gervonta Davis would probably need a knockout to win against Gary Russell Jr. after about eight rounds, and that the only way that Gervonta is going to beat Gary Russell is if Gary Russell really loses a step, because there's a difference in skill, and maturity between the two. With Gary Russell Jr. being in his early 30s and Gervonta Davis being in his mid 20s, Gary Russell Jr. still has the savvy and the savviness and the ring IQ advantage over Gervonta Davis, but Gervonta Davis has He has that raw force and speed and athleticism on his side that can cause the older fighter, some difficulties. However, what's the realness in this situation happening? More than likely, that fight is never going to happen, and it doesn't. And I don't think it has anything to do with Gervonta Davis, other than I did hear that there's a specific order of fights that Gervonta Davis wants to have next, and I think he said that he wants to fight Teofimo. I had written it down. He wanted to fight Ryan Garcia, Teofimo Lopez, Devin Haney, then Josh Taylor. Though in that particular order. So obviously Gary Russell Jr. is nowhere in that scenario, and so more than likely that fight's not going to happen. Gervonta Davis is an excellent fighter, but he's on an island to himself, and that is the Mayweather Promotions. Mayweather Promotions Island, and that is the one that is looking to make really big fights and not necessarily looking to make great fights with great matchups. So where Gary Russell Jr. and Tank is like a fight that if you did it in the DMV would do, or anywhere really, would do a ton of numbers, would be a really, really big fight. It doesn't fit that mode that Floyd Mayweather and Leonard Ellerbe have for Gervonta Davis's career, which is pretty much to fight like Ryan, Teofimo, right, Lopez, and Garcia, to fight both of those guys, because what you have like cross-sectional crowds where you can have black fight fans that would be there, and you have a large number of Mexican or Spanish-speaking fans, and therefore you could blow up the numbers. And you can't really argue about Gervonta Davis and that mechanism that they've had, the way that they've gone about, or the methodology that they've used to grow Gervonta Davis, because Gervonta Davis is becoming one of the biggest stars in boxing. He sold out, I think, in 5 or 6 different major cities. He's now been on a successful pay-per-view. His name is out there as being one of the big stars in boxing. And if you just throw Gervonta Davis in with anybody willy-nilly, you may not be able to get to where you're going to. I thought there was a smart move to get, go the route of trying to get belts in multiple divisions. So, he's won belts at 130. He's won it at 135. So he moves up and he gets a 4th with Mario Barrios, which I think is, excellent matchmaking. Now they're talking about potentially moving him up to fight Keith Thurman up at welterweight to become a 4-division champion. That now it would make you think that because he's willing to fight Keith Thurman that, it must be an easy fight with Gary Russell Jr. And that's not the case, man. Gary Russell Jr. and Keith Thurman are in 2 different times in their career, and Gary Russell Jr. doesn't necessarily need to, in order to beat fighters, he doesn't need the same things that Keith Thurman needs to beat fighters, which is Keith Thurman's, one-time Thurman, his power. But anyway, I just really would love if this fight could happen, but I know that it's a wish and a dream, but I got to rep Gary Russell Jr. I think Gary Russell Jr. is one of the best fighters in boxing. Hopefully he can get like the Leo Santa Cruz fight. He can get an Oscar Valdez fight, because I don't think Gervonta Davis is even coming back down to 130. But anyway, that's my take on the situation. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.